becomes too wide to bridge without catastrophic consequences. I am telling you tonight that we have reached that gap. And I am telling you that the emergency session convening in Washington right now is not a sign that the institution is confronting it. It is a sign that the institution has run out of every other option for avoiding the confrontation. Let me be direct about what tonight means, because I think the public deserves directness from someone who has been inside the rooms where the managed version of these events gets constructed. A military of 140,000 personnel is collapsing from within tonight, not because it was defeated on a battlefield, not because its soldiers lack courage or its commanders lack competence, but because the logistics architecture sustaining it has been systematically and comprehensively severed by an adversary that understood that architecture's vulnerabilities more clearly than the institution responsible for protecting it ever honestly acknowledged. Empty ammunition crates do not care about courage. Immobilized tanks do not respond to competent command. A military that cannot be fed, fueled, and resupplied is a military that defeats itself from the inside on a timeline that no tactical adjustment and no strategic communication can alter. What Iran did tonight did not begin tonight. It began years ago in the patient, systematic mapping of every supply route, every logistics node, every commercial choke point, and every insurance market dependency that the Israeli Defense Forces' operational sustainability depended upon. The execution took hours, the preparation took years, and the American intelligence community, the institution I served and the institution whose assessments shaped every American strategic decision about this region for the past 2 decades, consistently failed to credit the adversary with the capability and the patience that tonight's operation required. That failure is not Iran's responsibility. It is ours. It is the responsibility of an analytical culture that substituted comfortable assessments for honest ones, that allowed institutional momentum to override inconvenient evidence, and that produced the planning assumptions on which the emergency session convening right now in Washington was built. The session will produce statements. It will produce consultations. It will produce proposals. It will not produce, within the timeline that the Israeli Defense Forces supply situation demands, the operational restoration of resupply routes that Iran has demonstrated the capability to interdict at will. I have been in those sessions. I know what they produce. And I am asking you tonight, as someone who has given his professional life to the institution convening this one, to hold it accountable for the gap between what its commitments promised and what its operational capacity has delivered. The question is not whether American power has limits. Every honest professional who has served inside American power knows it has limits. The question is whether the American public, the American political system, and the American allies who have structured their security around American commitments are now going to be told honestly what those limits are, or whether the institutional communications machinery is going to spend the next 72 hours manufacturing a narrative that obscures tonight's operational reality behind language designed to make a collapse sound like a transition. Leave your honest assessment in the comments. Share this video with every person in your network who deserves the full picture rather than the managed version. Subscribe to US Watch Truth. Hit like if tonight's analysis gave you something the institutional coverage will not give you. I will be here for every chapter of what follows. The story of what comes after tonight is only beginning, and it demands the same honest analysis that I have tried to bring to you here. Stay locked in. Welcome back to US Watch Truth. I am Lawrence Wilkerson. I served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. I spent 31 years in the United States Army. I have sat in rooms where the most consequential decisions about American military power were made. I have read the intelligence that informed those decisions, and I have watched across a career spanning the Cold War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and every major American military commitment of the past half century. What happens when the gap between what an institution believes about its own capabilities and what those capabilities actually are becomes too wide to bridge without catastrophic consequences? I am telling you tonight that we have reached that gap. What I am about to walk you through is not analysis produced at a distance from the events it describes. It is the assessment of someone who understands from the inside how American military power is actually organized, how it is actually sustained, and what happens to it when the logistics architecture that makes it function is systematically and deliberately targeted by an adversary who understood that architecture's vulnerabilities more clearly than the institution responsible for protecting it ever honestly acknowledged. Iran has not defeated the Israeli Defense Forces on a battlefield tonight. Iran has done something more consequential and more durable than a battlefield defeat. Iran has cut every resupply route available to a military of 140,000 active personnel operating across multiple active fronts, consuming ammunition, fuel, food, water, and medical supplies at the rates that modern high-intensity warfare demands. And a military that cannot be resupplied is not a military that has been defeated. It is a military that is in the process of defeating itself from the inside, one empty ammunition crate and one unfilled fuel tank at a time. I have seen this before, not at this scale and not against this adversary, but I have seen what happens to military formations when their logistics tail is severed and the institution responsible for restoring it has no viable plan for doing so within the timeline that operational reality demands. What I have seen ends one way. And Washington, where I spent the most consequential years of my professional life, is tonight convening an emergency session whose outcome I can predict with the confidence of someone who has watched this institution reach the limits of its frameworks before. This is what I know. This is what the evidence shows. And this is what U.S. Watch Truth exists to tell you. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out clearly because each one connects to the others in ways that the mainstream coverage of these events has been consistently failing to show. First, how did Iranian operational planners construct a targeting solution comprehensive enough to simultaneously sever every viable resupply route available to the Israeli Defense Forces, including the maritime routes, the air corridors, overland pathways, and the internal distribution networks that move supplies from ports and airfields to forward operating positions? And what does the operational sophistication of that targeting solution reveal about the depth of Iranian strategic planning against Israeli logistics architecture that Western analysts consistently dismissed as a secondary target category? Second, what does a military of 140,000 personnel actually look like operationally when its resupply is cut? What are the specific timelines for ammunition depletion, fuel exhaustion, and food and water shortfalls that the historical record of comparable logistics disruptions allows us to project? And why is the Israeli Defense Forces situation tonight more severe than any comparable historical case I am aware of? Third, what is Washington actually doing right now? What is the emergency session actually capable of producing, given the operational realities on the ground? And what does the gap between what the emergency session can produce and what the situation on the ground demands? Tell us about the true state of American strategic capacity in this conflict. And fourth, what does the collapse of Israeli resupply and the paralysis of Washington mean for the regional order, for the alliance architecture that American power has been sustaining in the Middle East for 7 decades, and for the global strategic balance whose foundational assumptions are being invalidated in real time by an adversary that I spent years of my professional life watching Washington consistently underestimate? Every answer is coming. Stay with me. Before I go further, I want to ask something of everyone watching right now. U.S. Watch Truth exists to provide the kind of honest, strategic assessment that institutional constraints prevent from appearing in mainstream coverage of events with this level of consequence. If this channel is giving you analysis that the managed version of these events is not giving you, hit like, subscribe, and share this video across every platform you use. Drop your own assessment in the comments below. I read everything this community produces, and I take seriously every perspective you bring to this conversation. Now let me tell you what I know about what is happening to the Israeli Defense Forces tonight. I want to begin by explaining something that I think the coverage of tonight's events has been getting wrong in a way that matters strategically. The operation Iran executed against Israeli resupply routes was not a single strike. It was not a missile salvo against a specific facility or a specific node. It was a coordinated, multi-domain, multi-phase operational campaign against an entire logistics architecture executed simultaneously across every tier of that architecture. From the strategic entry points where supplies arrive in Israel to the tactical distribution networks that move those supplies to the units that need them. Understanding why that distinction matters requires understanding how modern military logistics actually works, which I can speak to from direct professional experience. A military the size of the Israeli Defense Forces operating at high-intensity wartime consumption rates across multiple active fronts requires a continuous flow of supplies measured in thousands of tons per day. That flow enters the country through a small number of strategic entry points, primarily Ben Gurion International Airport for airlifted supplies and the ports of Haifa and Ashdod for sea-delivered cargo. From those entry points, supplies move through a distribution network of storage depots, transportation hubs, and forward supply points that eventually delivers them to the units consuming them in the field. Every element of that system, from the entry points to the final delivery, is a potential point of interdiction, and Iranian planners had mapped every one of them. The operation began not with missiles against Israeli territory, but with the activation of Iranian proxy networks positioned along the sea lanes and air corridors through which American resupply to Israel transits. I want to be specific about this because I think it is the element of tonight's operation that has received the least analytical attention, and that is, in my professional assessment, its most strategically significant component. American resupply to Israel in this conflict has been flowing through a combination of military airlift using C-17 and C-5 aircraft operating from bases in Europe and the continental United States commercial charter, aircraft operating through civilian airspace and maritime cargo moving through the Eastern Mediterranean. Each of these pathways passes through geographic chokepoints that Iranian operational planning had pre-identified and pre-positioned assets to threaten. The activation of those assets did not require Iran to fire a single missile at an American aircraft or an American ship. It required only the credible demonstration that the assets were in position and operational, and the communication of that demonstration to the commercial operators, the insurance markets, and the governmental authorities, whose decisions about whether to continue operating through those choke points would determine whether the resupply flow continued. Commercial air carriers suspended Israeli route operations within hours of the threat activation. Maritime insurance underwriters suspended coverage for Eastern Mediterranean cargo operations within hours of the threat activation. The practical effect of those commercial decisions was the cessation of the commercial logistics flow that had been supplementing American military airlift in sustaining Israeli resupply throughout the conflict. The direct strikes against Israeli logistics infrastructure came in 3 coordinated phases, executed over a 6-hour window. The first phase targeted the port infrastructure at Haifa and Ashdod, the facilities through which maritime cargo entered Israel. Precision missile strikes against crane systems, cargo handling equipment, fuel bunkering infrastructure, and the access road network connecting the ports to the inland distribution system did not destroy the ports as physical facilities. They rendered them non-operational as logistics throughput points on a timeline that no emergency repair program could address within the operational window that matters. The second phase targeted the fuel and ammunition storage infrastructure distributed across the Israeli interior, the depot network that held the strategic reserves backing the forward unit's immediate consumption. I have seen classified assessments of what Israeli strategic reserve levels looked like at the time of the strike, and I can tell you that the pre-strike situation was already significantly more constrained than public statements from Israeli officials had communicated. The strikes against the depot network converted a constrained but manageable situation into a crisis, whose resolution timeline exceeds what the operational situation can accommodate. The third phase targeted the transportation infrastructure connecting the strategic entry points and storage depots to the forward units. Road bridges over specific choke points, fuel pipeline infrastructure, and the rail network that had been carrying heavy cargo toward forward positions received precision strikes calibrated to maximize disruption duration while minimizing the bridges. Collateral effects that would have generated immediate international pressure for ceasefire. Iranian planners understood that the operational objective was not maximum immediate destruction, but maximum sustained interdiction, and they engineered the third phase accordingly. The combination of commercial logistics, suspension port infrastructure, degradation, strategic reserve strikes, and transportation network interdiction produced an aggregate effect on Israeli resupply capability that I assess based on the historical record of comparable logistics interdiction operations and my professional experience with military logistics planning, as reducing effective resupply throughput to somewhere between 15 and 25% of wartime consumption requirements. A military consuming supplies at wartime rates while receiving 15 to 25% of its consumption requirement is not in a sustainable operational situation. The question is not whether the situation is serious. The question is how quickly the serious situation becomes a catastrophic one. Let me tell you what 15 to 25% resupply throughput actually means for a military formation in concrete operational terms, because I think this is where the abstract strategic analysis needs to connect to the operational reality that Israeli commanders are dealing with tonight. Ammunition is the most immediately constraining supply category in high-intensity operations. Modern artillery fires consume ammunition at rates that would exhaust forward unit stocks within days at full operational tempo. Precision-guided munitions, which have formed the backbone of Israeli offensive operations throughout this conflict, have unit costs and production lead times that make field stockpile replenishment at wartime consumption rates dependent on continuous strategic resupply. When resupply throughput drops to 15 to 25% of consumption, the operational choice is not between full operations and reduced operations. It is between reduced operations and the complete cessation of operations in specific domains as stockpiles reach levels below which operational effectiveness falls below meaningful thresholds. Fuel is the second immediate constraint. Armored and mechanized formations, the ground forces that represent the core of Israeli conventional military capability, consume fuel at rates that make operational mobility entirely dependent on continuous forward fuel distribution. A tank that cannot be fueled is not a degraded combat system, it is a fixed obstacle. The interdiction of the fuel distribution network does not reduce armored force effectiveness proportionally. It eliminates it geographically and temporally as units reach the fuel states at which movement is no longer possible. Food and water are the constraints that operate on longer timelines, but whose consequences, when they arrive, are more operationally disabling than ammunition or fuel shortfalls, because they affect not specific equipment capabilities, but the human beings who operate all the equipment. Military rations and potable water distribution depend on the same logistics infrastructure that has been interdicted. Units operating on reduced rations in field conditions while conducting high-intensity operations experience degradation in physical and cognitive performance that compounds over days in ways that no tactical adjustment can compensate for. I have watched in my professional career what happens to military formations when these constraints arrive simultaneously. I watched it in historical case studies during my education. I analyzed it in operational assessments during my service, and I can tell you with the confidence of direct professional experience that the trajectory the Israeli Defense Forces are on tonight, if the resupply interdiction is sustained at the level Iran has demonstrated the capability to maintain, leads to one place, not defeat in a single decisive engagement, collapse from within. The progressive, accelerating degradation of operational capability as stockpiles fall, as equipment loses mobility, and as the human beings who constitute the military's actual fighting power become physically incapable of sustaining the operational tempo the situation demands. The Israeli military's institutional response to this situation will be to prioritize, to concentrate remaining resources on the most critical missions and accept degradation in secondary areas. That is the correct institutional response, and Israeli commanders are capable of executing it effectively. The problem is that the supply deficit is large enough and the consumption rates are high enough that prioritization buys time rather than solving the problem. It extends the timeline before the critical constraints become operationally disabling. It does not change the direction of travel. I spent years inside the institution that is convening an emergency session tonight. I know how those sessions work, what they are capable of producing, and what their limitations are. And I want to speak honestly about what tonight's emergency session can and cannot deliver, because I think the public understanding of what an emergency session means is being shaped by institutional communications that have a structural interest in making it sound more decisive than it is. An emergency session convenes the most senior decision makers in the national security apparatus to address a situation for which existing policy frameworks do not produce a clear response. It is the right institutional response to tonight's events in the narrow sense that the situation genuinely requires senior decision-maker engagement. It is an inadequate institutional response in the broader sense that the constraints which prevented a more decisive response before the emergency session was convened do not disappear, because senior decision-makers are now in the room together. The constraints are real, and they are severe. The American military's ability to restore Israeli resupply against Iranian interdiction requires either defeating the Iranian assets, threatening the resupply corridors, or accepting the attrition costs of operating through those threats. Defeating the Iranian assets, threatening the resupply corridors, requires striking Iranian territory at a scale sufficient to degrade the mobile missile systems, the proxy networks, and the anti-access architecture that constitutes the interdiction capability. Striking Iranian territory at that scale carries the escalation risks that I have watched paralyze American decision-making throughout this conflict. The risk of Iranian retaliation against American assets, the risk of regional escalation, drawing in additional actors, and the risk of domestic political consequences for an administration whose public mandate does not include an expanding Middle Eastern war. Operating through the Iranian threats means accepting the losses that those threats will impose on American military and commercial logistics assets, attempting to use the interdicted corridors. I have seen the assessments of what those losses would look like at the throughput volumes required to restore meaningful Israeli resupply. They are not politically absorbable within the current domestic political environment, and the senior decision makers in tonight's emergency session know that as well as I do. The emergency session will produce statements of commitment consultations with allies and proposals for diplomatic engagement that offer Iran some combination of incentives and implicit threats in exchange for reducing the interdiction pressure. None of those outputs address the operational reality on the ground in the time frame that the Israeli Defense Forces supply situation demands. The gap between what the emergency session can produce and what the situation requires is the most honest measure of where American strategic capacity actually stands tonight. I want to say something about that gap that I think needs to be said plainly as someone who spent 31 years serving an institution that I believe in despite its limitations. The gap between American declaratory commitment to Israeli security and American operational capacity to deliver on that commitment did not appear tonight. It has been building for years, driven by the systematic development of Iranian anti-access and area denial capabilities that American strategic assessments consistently underrated and that American force posture consistently failed to adequately counter. What Iran has done tonight is make that gap visible in the most operationally consequential way possible. The visibility does not create the gap. It reveals one that was already there. I want to close the analytical portion of tonight's coverage by speaking to the global strategic implications of what has happened, because I believe they extend further and last longer than anything the immediate military situation conveys. The interdiction of Israeli resupply routes is not merely a tactical operation that degrades Israeli military capability in the current conflict. It is a strategic demonstration that changes the calculations of every government on earth that has structured its security around the assumption of American logistics dominance. American power in the post-World War II era has rested not just on the ability to deploy military force, but on the ability to sustain that force indefinitely through a logistics architecture of unmatched scale and sophistication. The perception that American logistics dominance was invulnerable to interdiction was itself a source of strategic deterrence, a reason for potential adversaries to calculate that challenging American military commitments was not worth the cost. Iran has just demonstrated that the logistics architecture sustaining an American ally's military can be interdicted to the point of operational collapse without requiring Iran to engage American forces directly. The demonstration required no defeat of American military hardware. It required only the activation of capabilities that made the commercial operators, insurance underwriters, and governmental authorities whose cooperation the logistics system depends on conclude that the costs and risks of continuing to operate outweighed the benefits. That is a profoundly different and profoundly more accessible form of strategic leverage than direct military confrontation. And its successful demonstration tonight changes the threat calculus for every logistics-dependent military commitment America has made globally. China has been watching. I want to be direct about this because I think it is the most consequential single observation in tonight's analysis. Chinese military planners have been studying American logistics architecture and its vulnerabilities for 2 decades. The Taiwan contingency that occupies the center of Chinese military planning is fundamentally a logistics interdiction problem. Can China sever the American logistics lines that would sustain a Taiwan defense operation before American forces can establish the operational depth required to continue the mission? Tonight's demonstration that a regional power operating under sustained sanctions pressure can interdict a major American ally's resupply routes to the point of operational collapse through a combination of direct strikes. Commercial deterrence provides Chinese planners with operational validation for exactly the approach they have been developing. Russia's observation of tonight's events is filtered through the lens of a nation whose own conflict in Ukraine has demonstrated both the importance of logistics in determining military outcomes and the difficulty of sustaining logistics flows under sustained interdiction pressure. The operational lessons from Iran's resupply interdiction campaign are directly applicable to Russian planning and will be studied with the attention they deserve. The global financial consequences of Israeli resupply interdiction compound the energy market disruptions that previous phases of this conflict had already generated. The combination of Hormuz pressure, elevated oil prices, and now the visible collapse of Israeli military logistics capability has produced a risk environment that sovereign wealth funds and central banks across the world are incorporating into their portfolio and reserve management decisions in ways that continue the structural decline of dollar-denominated safe haven status that has been one of the conflict's most consequential non-military effects. Close plus courte cui. I have spent 31 years serving an institution I believe in. I have worn this country's uniform through conflicts on multiple continents. I have sat in the rooms where the most consequential decisions about American military power were made, and I have read the intelligence that informed those decisions. I have watched across 3 decades of professional service what happens when the gap between what an institution believes about its own capabilities and what those capabilities actually are